The Viking Age, a period spanning from the late 8th century to the early 11th century, is characterized by its blend of maritime audacity, exploration, and unique traditions that have intrigued historians and archaeologists for centuries. Beyond the images of warriors and ships sailing across oceans, the Vikings left a cultural legacy that extends far beyond their raids. Their rituals, social practices, and ways of life offer a profound insight into a society that thrived amid adversity and constant change. Ritualistic tattoos, the permanent marks of the Vikings. The image of tattooed Vikings is a powerful and enduring representation of their connection to their beliefs, achievements, and social status. Although direct archaeological evidence of Viking tattoos is non-existent due to the degradation of organic materials, historical accounts, such as that of the Arab traveller Ahmad ibn Fadlan, provide a fascinating window into this practice. During his journey along the Volga River in the 10th century, Ibn Fadlan described the Rus, a group of Scandinavian Vikings, as individuals tattooed from their fingers to their necks, with designs evoking trees, snakes, and complex patterns. In the Viking Age, tattooing was a painstaking and painful process that reflected not only the physical endurance of the wearer, but also their devotion to a ritual marking their personal and spiritual identity. The tools likely included bone needles, thorns, or sharp metals, while the inks were derived from natural resources such as soot, ash, plant dyes, and powdered minerals. These inks were absorbed into the skin through a repetitive process that pierced deeply, leaving permanent marks symbolizing more than ornamentation. They were a record of the individual's life, faith, and lineage. The designs of Viking tattoos went far beyond aesthetics. They represented essential aspects of their worldview, such as trees, a key symbol in Norse mythology that alluded to Yggdrasil, the world tree that connected the 9 worlds. Snakes, often associated with Jörmungandr, the world serpent, could signify power, danger, or even the eternal cycle of life and death. Geometric patterns, common in Viking art, reflected the harmony and order the Norse saw in their environment, while runes and magical symbols etched into the skin could invoke divine protection, strength in battle, or success in travel. For warriors, tattoos were not only a display of strength, but also a reminder of their conquests and achievements. For others, these markings could act as permanent amulets, meant to protect the bearer in this world and ensure their place in Valhalla or the afterlife. Although tattoos in Viking culture are primarily supported by written sources and cultural reconstructions, their legacy persists in modern practices. Accounts such as Ibn Fadlan's, combined with representations in Viking art, stone carvings, and textiles, suggest that the tradition of adorning the skin with symbols was more than an artistic expression. It was a tangible link to the myths and beliefs that defined the Vikings. Today, tattoos inspired by Viking iconography have experienced a resurgence, with designs evoking the same ideas of strength, spirituality, and connection to nature that the Norse might have valued over 1,000 years ago. While the details of the original process may remain lost to time, the concept of marking the skin as a significant and personal act directly connects modern generations with the spiritual legacy of the Vikings. Ritual cannibalism, the dark side of Viking tradition. Cannibalism, although one of the most disturbing practices, has occasionally been linked to ancient cultures, and the Vikings are no exception. However, its presence in Viking society was not widespread. It was an isolated phenomenon that occurred under exceptional circumstances, primarily in the context of war or rituals linked to their conception of strength, honor, and survival. The idea that Vikings may have resorted to cannibalism has long been a subject of controversy among scholars and a constant source of fascination. While evidence of this behavior is limited and difficult to interpret, both historical accounts and archaeological findings shed an unsettling light on this dark aspect of Viking culture. The Norse sagas, a complex blend of mythology, history, and legend, offer some of the earliest references to cannibalistic practices among the Vikings. In these accounts, cannibalism was not seen as an act of desperation or senseless violence, but as a ritual imbued with meaning. Viking warriors, known for their bravery in battle, sometimes ate the flesh of their fallen enemies as a way to absorb their strength and abilities. This belief reflected the Vikings' view that by consuming the flesh of an adversary, one could take in their power and skill. This type of ritual was linked to a warrior ideology where strength, bravery, and victory were central aspects of personal and collective identity. Moreover, the Vikings were known for their extreme practices to intimidate their enemies. Some accounts describe how warriors would consume the remains of their victims not only as a symbolic act, but also as a way of sending a message of terror to their rivals. These acts of ritualized cannibalism served as a manifestation of power and dominance, where the enemy not only fell in battle but was completely stripped of their humanity, even after death. Archaeological evidence suggesting the existence of ritual cannibalism among the Vikings is scarce but intriguing. In several Viking burial sites, particularly in the British Isles, human remains with cut marks that appear to correspond to skinning practices have been found. These cuts are consistent with how bodies would have been processed for meat extraction, suggesting that under extreme circumstances, Vikings may have resorted to eating their dead or even their enemies. However, scholars continue to debate the interpretation of these findings. Some argue that the marks observed on the bones could be the result of post-mortem dismemberment rituals, a practice carried out to separate fallen warriors from their weapons and clothing, in accordance with certain funeral traditions, but without any implications of cannibalism. Others contend that these rituals had no connotation of human consumption, but served to honor or perform a final service to the dead. Although cannibalism has its place in Viking mythology, some studies suggest that the Vikings may have turned to the practice in a more pragmatic way during times of desperation, such as during long sieges or journeys. In those moments of extreme need, when food resources were scarce, cannibalism may have become a desperate response to famine. The sagas that recount the Vikings' arrival in new lands or their travels through the north often exaggerate the harsh conditions the warriors faced, reinforcing the idea that in times of crisis, any means of survival might have been employed. Viking berserkers, the fury ritual that defied gods and men among the most unsettling and least understood traditions of Viking culture, stands the figure of the berserkers. These warriors, considered the pinnacle of ferocity on the battlefield, were feared not only by their enemies but also by their own allies, due to the rituals and behaviors that defined their existence. At the heart of their reputation was the berserker gang, a ritual state of frenzy that transformed ordinary men into almost supernatural fighting machines. The berserker gang was not simply a fit of rage, it was the result of a deeply ingrained ritual preparation in Viking beliefs. Before battle, berserkers participated in ceremonies designed to unleash their connection with primordial forces, often evoking the spirit of wild animals such as bears and wolves. These ceremonies could include rhythmic chants, frenzied dances, and the ingestion of natural substances that altered perception and behavior. According to the sagas, the warriors invoked Odin, the god of war and wisdom, seeking his blessing to become his divine instruments of destruction. A distinctive feature of the berserker gang ritual was its ability to completely transform the warrior's personality. During the trance, berserkers imitated the animals they represented, roaring like bears, howling like wolves, and biting their shields as if they were prey. This behavior was not merely symbolic. They sought to channel the strength and ferocity of these creatures to abandon all rationality and fear, becoming instruments of pure instinct and aggression. The mystery of how they managed to enter this trance state remains a subject of speculation. One theory suggests the use of hallucinogenic mushrooms like Amanita muscaria, whose effects include visions, euphoria, and a temporary increase in perceived physical strength. Another hypothesis points to the use of herbs like Jimson weed or birch infusions, both known in the traditional botany of Northern Europe. However, the debate persists as historical sources do not accurately document these details, leaving room for interpretation. The impact of these traditions extended beyond the battlefield. The berserkers' frenzy was so intense that they often lost control even after the battle, attacking indiscriminately allies and enemies alike. This unpredictability generated both fear and respect, and Viking leaders often used them as double-edged weapons, unleashing them in the most critical moments while keeping them in check during times of peace. With the arrival of Christianity in Scandinavia, the berserker gang ritual was condemned as a heretical and dangerous practice. religious and political leaders of the new order sought to eradicate these traditions, claiming that their brutality and connection to the ancient gods were incompatible with Christian teachings. This change marked the beginning of the decline of the berserkers, who ceased to be central figures in Viking society and became relics of a bygone era. Nevertheless, echoes of this unsettling tradition remained in the collective memory of the Nordic peoples, immortalized in sagas, songs, and tales that described the berserkers as the most feared warriors of their time. Their transformation ritual, though dark and enigmatic, serves as a reminder of how the Vikings embraced both divine and animalistic forces to face a world full of challenges and conflicts. Human sacrifices, the blood that fed the Viking gods. Human sacrifice was one of the most shocking and, at the same time, fundamental practices in the religious worldview of the Vikings. These warriors, known for their skill in battle and their connection with the supernatural, believed that blood was the key to maintaining the balance between the gods and men. The blot, a sacrifice ritual deeply rooted in Nordic culture, was performed not only to honor the gods, but also to gain their favor and ensure the prosperity of the community. While offerings of animals, food, or valuable objects were common in these rituals, human sacrifices, though rarer, held a prominent place on occasions of special significance or need. The blot was a ceremony that formed a central part of Viking beliefs. This sacrifice ritual, which was performed throughout the year, was crucial for maintaining contact between humans and deities. The blot involved the offering of the best that the Vikings had, whether livestock, food, or even artifacts, with the aim of attracting the benevolence of the gods and ensuring a bountiful harvest, victories in battle, or protection from natural calamities. In times of war or crisis, however, more drastic sacrifices were required to appease the divine forces. When circumstances demanded a more powerful act of sacrifice, the Vikings turned to what we now call human sacrifice. This type of offering was dedicated to the main deities of the Norse pantheon, such as Odin, Thor, and Freyr, who, according to Viking mythology, required the blood of mortals to balance the divine and human worlds. One of the most detailed sources about Viking human sacrifices comes from Adam of Bremen, an 11th century German chronicler, who described in his work Gesta Hammarbogensis Ecclesiae Pontificum the religious practices at the Uppsala temple in Sweden. Adam recounted that every 9 years, a large-scale festival was held in honor of the gods, where 9 men from each species, including humans, were sacrificed. These sacrifices took place in the sacred forest of Uppsala, where the bodies of the victims were hung from trees as offerings. These men, ceremonially chosen, were offered to the gods to guarantee the peace and well-being of the community. Human sacrifice in this context was not just an act of religious devotion, but also a way to ensure protection against evil forces, wars, or natural disasters. Adam of Bremen, who described these events with a tone of awe and horror, emphasized the importance of the ritual in Viking culture. According to his account, human sacrifice was perceived as an essential act to ensure that the gods maintained their favor over men. The Vikings did not see blood as just a biological fluid, but as a medium that connected the mortal and divine worlds. In their belief system, the sacrifice of human lives, animals, and other precious objects was a way to send energy to the gods in a symbolic exchange that maintained cosmic balance. By shedding blood, the Vikings believed they were offering a part of themselves to the deities, ensuring that life continued in the world of men and that the divine forces favored their lives. This was reflected in the ceremonies where the victims, often chosen for their honor or status, became messengers between the gods and humans. Through ritual death, the aim was not only to appease the divine will, but also to send a message to nearby communities that the strength of the gods was active and that divine protection was something that could only be maintained through blood and devotion. Although direct evidence of Viking human sacrifices is limited, there are several archaeological findings that point to the practice. In some burial sites, particularly in the British Isles and Scandinavian lands, human remains have been found with clear signs of violent rituals, such as knife wounds or decapitation marks. In many cases, the bodies did not show signs of being treated as mere corpses, but instead showed evidence of having been sacrificed for a specific purpose, to offer them to the gods. These remains, although not always directly related to human sacrifice, provide a window into the importance of religious rituals in Viking life. As Christianity spread across Scandinavia, the practice of human sacrifice began to decline. The new faith, which strongly rejected pagan rituals, led to the dissolution of temples and traditional religious practices. Christianity took root in the Viking lands, transforming not only spiritual beliefs, but also the ways of honoring the deities. However, Viking human sacrifices remain a fascinating and mysterious facet of their culture, a reminder of the deep connection the Vikings had with the divine and with the cyclical nature of life and death. Although the practice disappeared with the arrival of Christianity, its legacy remains etched in the sagas and in the accounts of the chroniclers who saw and feared them. Slave cremation, the darkest funeral ritual of the Viking Age. In the rigid social hierarchy of the Viking Age, slaves or thralls occupied the lowest level, but their role was not limited solely to everyday tasks. In death, some thralls also became key elements in funeral rituals, sacrificed to accompany their masters to the afterlife. One of the most notorious accounts of these practices comes from Ahmad ibn Fadlan, a 10th century Arab traveler who documented a Viking funeral in the Volga River region. His description is one of the most detailed sources on Viking funeral rituals, revealing a disturbing tradition: the cremation of female slaves as part of the tribute to a deceased Viking chief. According to Ibn Fadlan, when a Viking chief died, his body was prepared for a funeral that was conducted with great pomp and solemnity. The corpse was placed in a boat along with his weapons, jewelry, animals, and other items that the Vikings considered essential for the afterlife. This ritual, intended to ensure a safe journey for the deceased to the beyond, included a human sacrifice, a slave selected to accompany the deceased on his journey. The process began with the selection of the slave, who, according to Ibn Fadlan, appeared to accept her fate without resistance. However, given the social circumstances and her servile position, it is unlikely that this acceptance was genuine. The slave was intoxicated with potent drinks to numb her and prepare her for what followed, a deeply disturbing ritual involving physical and psychological abuse. In Ibn Fadlan's most shocking description, the slave was taken to a tent where, according to the traveler, the men of the deceased chief abused her as part of the ritual. This act, while difficult to fully interpret, seemed linked to the idea of consecrating the slave as part of the deceased's retinue in the afterlife. The culmination of the ritual was the sacrifice of the slave. A woman, identified as a close relative of the chief, strangled and then stabbed the slave before placing her body alongside that of the chief on the funeral pyre. Once the sacrifice was completed, the boat, loaded with the remains of the chief and his slave, was set on fire, sending their ashes to the sky as an offering to the gods. Human sacrifice at Viking funerals reflected a deep belief in the value of blood and life as currency exchanged with the gods. For the Vikings, the death of a slave not only honored the deceased chief, but also ensured his transition to Valhalla, Odin's realm, or other spiritual destinations depending on his role in life. The slave became an eternal servant in the afterlife, reinforcing the social structure even beyond death. Moreover, this type of ritual underscored the Viking belief in the necessary accompaniment to face the afterlife. The slave was not merely a sacrifice, she was an essential part of the preparations for the deceased's journey, providing company and assistance in the spiritual world. The Blood Eagle, the most feared execution of the Viking Age. Among the most controversial and chilling traditions of Viking culture, the Blood Eagle stands out as a symbol of ritual brutality. This method of execution, reserved for the most hated enemies, combines extreme violence with symbolism deeply rooted in the Viking worldview. Although its existence remains a subject of debate among historians, the Nordic sagas describe it in such vivid detail that it has left an indelible mark on our perception of the Vikings. According to the sagas, the Blood Eagle ritual began with the victim immobilized face down. Using sharp tools, the executioner cut the skin of the back, exposing the ribs. These were then separated from the spine one by one, and toward the end of the procedure, the victim's lungs were extracted and spread outward to create the appearance of bloodied wings. This act, according to the accounts, was carried out while the victim was still alive, prolonging their suffering to heighten the psychological impact both on the victim and the spectators. The blood eagle was not merely an execution, it was a declaration of revenge and power. The victim, often a political or personal enemy, was chosen not only for their defeat, but to send a message to the living that disloyalty, betrayal, or open enmity with the perpetrators would have devastating consequences. The blood eagle appears in several Nordic sagas, including the saga of Ragnar Lodbrok and the Orkneyinga saga. One of the most famous accounts describes how Ivar the Boneless, son of Ragnar Lodbrok, used this method to avenge his father's death. In the story, Ivar executes King Aella of Northumbria, the man responsible for throwing Ragnar into a pit of snakes. According to the saga, Aella was subjected to the blood eagle as an exemplary punishment, designed not only to avenge Ragnar's memory but also to reaffirm the superiority of Ragnar's legendary sons. The blood eagle was not an act of arbitrary violence, but a ritual deeply rooted in the Vikings' spiritual and cultural beliefs. In Norse mythology, birds, especially ravens and eagles, are associated with Odin, the god of war, wisdom, and death. These creatures were considered messengers from the beyond and were linked to battlefields, where they fed on the dead. By performing the blood eagle, the Vikings were not only punishing their enemy, but also offering a spectacle that invoked Odin's power and his control over life and death. The ritual also had a practical purpose: to inspire fear in the enemies and reinforce the reputation of the perpetrators. In a society where strength, honor, and vengeance were core values, the blood eagle was both a spiritual act and a tool of political and social control. The historicity of the blood eagle has been intensely debated among scholars. Some argue that the descriptions in the sagas are literary exaggerations, designed to dramatize the stories of Viking heroes and villains. Others point out that there is no conclusive archaeological evidence to support the practice, and that mentions in the sagas could be symbolic interpretations rather than literal accounts. However, some experts suggest that the ritual could have been real, though uncommon, and that its absence in the archaeological record is due to the transient nature of human remains subjected to such extreme practices. The fact that the blood eagle is mentioned in multiple sagas, often in different contexts, adds weight to the possibility that this execution was at least a known tradition, even if it wasn't a widespread practice. The blood eagle remains one of the most fascinating and terrifying aspects of Viking tradition. Although its historical reality remains uncertain, its cultural impact is undeniable. It represents a dark and ritualized side of Viking violence, merging brutality with profound religious and social symbolism. Beyond its horror, the ritual offers a glimpse into how the Vikings understood death, vengeance, and their connection with the gods. The blood eagle is not just a tale of torture. It is a reflection of a culture that revered both life and death, viewing both as realms where the most important battles were fought not only on land, but also in the domains of the gods. Infant mortality and harsh upbringing, the price of survival in the Viking Age. Childhood in the Viking Age was a stage filled with challenges, marked by alarmingly high rates of infant mortality and a style of upbringing that prioritized survival in a relentless environment. The combination of diseases, malnutrition, and strict social expectations created a harsh reality for Viking children, who had to adapt quickly to a world where physical and mental resilience were essential to thrive. Infant mortality among the Vikings was high, with estimates suggesting that up to 30% of children died before reaching the age of 5. The primary causes were infectious diseases, malnutrition, and the harsh climatic conditions of Northern Europe. The medicine of the time, based mainly on herbal remedies and spiritual practices, offered few effective solutions against epidemics or complications during childbirth. Archaeological records indicate that newborns and young children often suffered from anemia and other nutritional deficiencies. This was partly due to limited diets during the long, severe winters, as well as intestinal diseases common in communities where hygiene was rudimentary. In Viking society, surviving was not enough. Being strong was essential. This mentality shaped the upbringing of children from their early years. Childhood was not seen as a period of prolonged protection and care, but as a stage of preparation for the demands of adulthood. Parents instilled values such as bravery, discipline, and loyalty through strict methods that today might be considered harsh or even cruel. Boys, in particular, were trained from a young age in martial skills and survival. They learned to handle weapons like swords, axes, and bows, even before reaching adolescence. This training was not optional, as it was expected that they would defend their homes and participate in raids or wars from an early age. Girls, while not trained as warriors, faced equally demanding training, learning tasks such as household management, agriculture, and, in some cases, medicine, while being instilled with the mental strength needed to endure the harshness of Viking life. One of the most shocking practices of Viking child-rearing was the exposure of unwanted newborns. Although this practice was not exclusive to the Vikings, it played a significant role in their culture. If a baby was born with deformities, serious illnesses, or simply at a time when the family could not support another member, the parents could abandon the baby outdoors where it would perish due to the weather or be taken by wild animals. This act, though brutal, was seen as a necessary form of natural selection to ensure the strength of the community. However, children who survived their early years and demonstrated physical strength were valued and became integral members of the family and community. Naming ceremonies, such as the Vatni or sprinkling with water, marked their formal acceptance into society. This ritual symbolized not only their welcome into the clan, but also the parents' commitment to their survival and upbringing. Viking traditions, often glorified for their bravery and maritime skills, hide much darker aspects that are rarely discussed in popular narratives. These disturbing rituals reflect a complex society where survival and honor were intertwined with extreme practices that today we would consider unacceptable. Human sacrifice, whether through religious rituals such as the blot or in war contexts, highlights the deep connection between the Vikings and their spiritual beliefs. These acts were not only offerings to the gods but also means to ensure the prosperity and protection of the community. The brutality of such practices underscores a culture that valued strength and loyalty over individual life, reflecting a mindset where the collective good prevailed over personal well-being. The lesser-known and more disturbing Viking traditions offer a fuller view of a civilization that, while admired for its achievements, also had dark facets that ensured its cohesion and survival. Recognizing and understanding these aspects allows us to appreciate the complexity of the Vikings, reminding us that every culture, no matter how fascinating, has its shadows that deserve to be explored and understood.